Ladies and gentlemen, patriots across America, thank you once again for tuning in to neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. We have a great schedule ahead of us today. We have a couple replays. Today's Mr. John O'Loughlin's day off. So I'm gonna replay a video from his that we Osprey Nation, we all got together last year for his father's memorial when this book was written. So I'm gonna play a video of that day and that trip of the actual memorial service itself. And here is just let everyone know we got George Webb at 12 p.m. coming up live on Research Roadshow. We got a Mark Kulak replay at 2 p.m. He'll be back tomorrow or Friday, hopefully. Then we have Neighborhood News Hour at 4 p.m. Everyone's favorite Neighborhood News Hour with Tyrone and Andy. Then after that, Wendy's World. It's Wendy's World. We're all just living in it with Wendy Sloan here at neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. So just to let everyone know, before we get into the McDuff video, you can go to screamingospreys.com. You can see the ospreys growing in the nest. You can watch John's video archive, his entire video archive. He's worked so hard to put together here at screamingospreys.com. He's done a lot of great book readings, a lot of great interviews, and a lot of great research has been done by John on McDuff Lives. And then you can get this book that him and his wife wrote and edited. McDuff Lives: The Life and Untimely Death of Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr. It's about his dad, and we're going to get into what his dad represented here in this upcoming video. But you can find this book. I actually was part of this. You know, we all got together in Maryland on Mystery Island. There was like 30 ospreys flocked out there for this weekend. And a couple of us, John, he just worked so hard writing and editing and getting all the pictures together and making sure the colors were all right. And sent it over to me, and this was the very first book we ever printed here at Neighborhood News Studio. This was the start of the paper printing process, the book printing process. And it was thanks to John O'Loughlin and his hard work. So, and then after that, we just it was like, George just was like, they can print books. I'm going to write like 10,000 of them. So George just took it to another level after this. But this was the start of it all. And you can find it at screamingospreys.com. So here, without further ado, is the McDuff Memorial. Sorry, the video camera was actually not working properly, and the sound, the actual camera crew, he had it filmed separately, had to tap into the sound, so I didn't get access to that. But it's doable and it's good, and you guys just enjoy the McDuff Memorial. This was filmed last year on June 6th.
There we go. And so he lived for 51 years, and they were some of the most exciting, action-packed, and difficult years that our country's ever experienced. World War II involved a lot of courage, a lot of fighting, a lot of death, a lot of serious injury, and a lot of questions that even today, seem to be unanswered. As we try to sort out what's going on in our world today, we can look back at the life of somebody who lived it and learn from my father's life and his experiences what we need to know to move forward from here. 50 years seems like a long time. It may just be an average lifetime if you look at the short lives of people in the past centuries. And so it's a time in which a lot of accomplishments can be made if we put our shoulders to the wheel and work. And that's what my father did for his whole life. In 50 years, the United States was built and launched. And I think it's interesting to note that both President Thomas F. Jefferson and President John Adams died on July the 4th, 50 years exactly of 1826, 50 years to the day after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Their deaths may have been a coincidence. They may have been the act of God. They may have been the result of some scheme behind the scenes that we can only look through darkly and try to figure out. I'm open to all of that. I think it's quite possible that there's still things that we don't understand about the lives and early deaths of those two presidents. But 50 years today is a transition, I think, not only for my father, but also for all of us. Because if we take this as the bookends of the 50 years that I believe he has spent here watching over me and my sisters and watching over us and our country and watching over our freedoms. And if we think, well, today is a day that Tom can rest and we can take up the burden. And as we do that, we will feel the power that comes from doing the right thing day after day, no matter what, to serve your country, to serve God, to serve your family, all the things we hold dear to us. That is the mission that people went to war in World War II to preserve. So I've asked Timothy Judd, violinist with the Richmond Symphony, who has become one of our Osprey group. He watches all of our shows and he sends me emails, and so I asked him to come up here if he'd like to come and play something, and he kindly agreed to do that. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Timothy to come on up here, and we will listen to him play the Navy hymn, and following that directly, Nicole Collins.
Give me 1 second.
All right, we're going to take a temporary break here.
Forgot about this malfunction here. Hopefully we can get rebooted.
Well, without further ado, I
think we're going to miss the violin, unfortunately.
Will be Nicole Collins, a soprano, a voice teacher, and a professional soprano here in the Washington area. I've had the privilege of singing with her on stage, and I can tell you she is a fabulous, fabulous performer and a colleague. So Timothy and then Nicole, you have the stage.
Oh, wait, never mind. Timothy Judd, it's a cool guy.
Now, to tell us a little bit about the city and the state where my father grew up, Hartford, Connecticut. We have the great privilege of having Andy Craig come down from Washington, D.C. today to tell us some things about Hartford, which he knows very well, a historian himself, as well as an attorney and an advocate for many very important causes. I met him and got to know him through his fantastic book, Presidential Puppetry. As a book which I think is going to be timeless in the way that it really does describe the scene behind the presidents of the past 30 years. What was really going on, Presidential Puppetry, a classic book by a classic gentleman, Andrew Craig.
Well, as you know, John's asked me to describe something about the culture and history and politics of Hartford, Connecticut, roughly from the time period of 1920 to 1975. You should know that the O'Loughlin family forebears had come to that region following the 1840s Irish potato famine. Family members ascended the social ladder in terms of jobs, education, and civic involvement. John's father, who we're here to honor, was a Harvard graduate, a war hero, and an attorney before undertaking top secret work for the FBI. But a number of family members, including Tom Jr., suffered personal setbacks that we should also describe. These sufferings include the divorce of Tom's parents early in their 1920s marriage. This is a particularly painful experience, magnified by the observant Roman Catholic culture of both families. Especially dramatic, and as recounted in John's powerful new memoir, was John's own struggles to connect with his father, who was being tormented at the time by serious workplace conflicts that were so important and so secret that they could not be shared with his family. This culminated in John's failed attempt 50 years ago this spring to meet with his father at his deathbed, essentially. That was foiled for reasons, personal reasons, apparently because his cancer-stricken father was too preoccupied with the other things going on in the world and his life. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but regarding Hartford, as mentioned, I can assist by sharing some recollections from my time as a reporter there. In 1970, I began as a reporter with the Hartford Courant, the state's leading news organization, and I remained in Hartford for the most part for the next 18 years with an interruption to attend law school. My home was a working class area of fairly rundown 3-story apartment buildings called Frog Hollow, but it had the advantage of being very close to the newspaper, the state legislature, and the courthouses. That provided a panorama for a young reporter like myself, then young. That city, Hartford, had been a centerpiece of American manufacturing, the insurance industry, and culture. The latter involving the world famous literary colony called Nook Farm, which involved Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe, among other luminaries. Now, here's a problem. When you ask an aging reporter to talk about their young life and what they know about it, we could go hither and yon into what I might think is interesting, but it's not giving due credit to the occasion of this memorial or the setting of this military museum, as well as your expectations. So I took my planning problem right to the top to seek the counsel of President Dwight D. Eisenhower, former Allied Supreme Commander during World War II, as you know. Now, one of his speechwriters, then young, named James Humes, recalls that in his first assignment writing for presidents, and James Hume wrote for 5 US presidents, he had a fairly routine announcement of remarks by President Eisenhower. And he goes into the White House Oval Office in 1959, and he starts talking. And suddenly, the president takes off his glasses, starts tapping them impatiently on the desk, and interrupts by saying, "What's the QED?" And the young speechwriter responded, "QED, Mr. President?" And the president said, "QED, don't you know what that is? Quod erat demonstranda. What is to be demonstrated? What's the point? What's the bottom line? If you can't put that in one sentence, you're wasting your time and you're wasting my time." So here's my QED. The title of this talk, and perhaps it might be appropriate for the other speakers: McDuff, a legacy of tragedy and triumph, of continuing importance. With that, let's set the scene about a century ago from the perspective of the O'Loughlin family in Hartford. Family patriarch John O'Loughlin, the great-grandfather of our John, worked a century ago at Colt Industries, founded in 1836 by Samuel Colt, the inventor of the first revolver. This was the gun that won the West, and it provided a key role for, until almost the current times, in providing good jobs with opportunities abounding in other manufacturing in Hartford. Hartford's Pratt & Whitney was also a world leader, this in the realm of machine tool production, which sounds very boring perhaps, except that's what helps make sewing machine equipment and other factory tools that create such products as bicycles and so many other things that we need. The city was also the main base of Royal and Underwood typewriter manufacturing. with lots of workers living in my future neighborhood of Frog Hollow, socializing in a bar that the O'Laughlin family ran on Main Street near Colt. John O'Loughlin's son, Tom O'Loughlin, who we're here to honor, was born in the 1890s. No, I'm sorry, I misspoke. That's the grandfather, Tom O'Loughlin Sr. He was born in the 1890s, and he was groomed for a place in the Connecticut establishment. He was the first to attend college, beginning here in the Washington area at the then new Catholic University. And he graduated in 1919 with a degree in law. But alcohol problems caused him to fail the bar exam and prompt his new wife to obtain a divorce, according to family lore. That was despite the birth of a new son, Tom Jr., whom we're honoring today. The father, Tom Sr., became a teacher and school principal. After the divorce, young Tom grew up in his more prosperous family of his grandparents. His mother was only able to see him on alternate weekends. She commuted during the week from central Connecticut all the way down to a job in New York City. Young Tom would write her a postcard almost every day when he wasn't occupied on its future military and other important work. Meanwhile, the family's high hopes for success passed from the alcoholic teacher, Tom Sr., to his brother John, who was a successful executive at the iconic Hartford Fire Insurance Company, the first insurance company in the United States, and it helped make Hartford famous as an insurance center because of its reputation of paying off its claims, which some competitors in the wild and woolly days might not have been that eager to do. At any rate, John O'Loughlin was an executive there, and his daughter married, his son married the daughter of Hartford Mayor James Kinsella, who was the first of the Irish-American Kinsella, there were three of them, to become mayor of Hartford. So we're seeing a pattern of ascendancy of the family here. But let's take a small detour away from the O'Loughlin family to survey, as John wanted, the status of Irish-American culture in Hartford during those years. There are national implications, both for the O'Loughlin family and I would suggest for the rest of us, that continue to this day. When thinking about this Irish-American culture, some of us might be thinking of some of our favorite Irish ballads, like from the Clancy Brothers or the Dubliners. And I've particularly been thinking of that in recent months with the passing of several of my Irish-American friends and mentors, including one named Finnegan, Robert Finnegan, a great iconoclastic reporter. But the O'Loughlin family was not of the hod-carrying stripe in those days. They were part of a ascendancy paralleled by the Kennedy family of Boston, of well-educated Irish-American families that were ambitious and successful in politics, including challenging the dominant Protestant, largely Republican power structure in Connecticut and elsewhere. Now, that power structure, in one sense, is symbolized by Yale College's elite secret society, Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones had been founded in the 1830s as a secret society. It involved tapping 15 students a year and inviting them to join the leadership of Skull and Bones, but also, in effect, the entire country. Now, it's reliably reported when you penetrate the secrecy that part of the funding for Skull and Bones, as well as for a number of these leading families, came from the opium trade. Now, this was described in history books and many other places as the tea trade or the spice trade. Now, even imagining, if we can, thinking, gee, people really seem to like their spices and they like their tea, but it's hard to imagine these great fortunes being built on that. Well, part of it was built on that, but the engine was profits from narcotics trafficking. I think we can reliably say this in the 1840s. And I'll pick as one example that I just recently researched for this, but you might find interesting, showing the connections from the past to current times, is the story of Cheney Mills, which is located just to the east of Hartford in the city of Manchester. Now, Cheney Mills started in the mid-1800s and advanced techniques for weaving silk, and it became the world's leader in manufacturing silk. And it's all very impressive. I mean, you don't easily build something like that, but it's reliably reported, again, by, this time I'll name the source, Trine Day Publishing has published some books on this, that the Cheney family was assisted in this time by the opium trade that helped pave the way for expertise and success in silk manufacturing. Now here's an interesting part of this, at least I thought was interesting, that as I go through recent revelations of who was in Skull and Bones, I counted 8 members of the Cheney family as within this elite 15-person-a-year society within the years 1894 to 1902, which is pretty remarkable. And yes, it's the same Cheney family that's famous today. Vice President Dick Cheney and his daughter, the Congresswoman from Wyoming. Well, taking another step back to the big picture, the most successful challenger to the power structure of the last century was John Bailey. John Bailey, born around 1907, was Harvard-educated native of Hartford. He became the Democratic state chairman in 1947. He continued that post until 1975, when I was a young reporter. So Bailey was constantly in the news. And one of his innovations was to bring forward Irish-American candidates like himself, Italian-American candidates, even Jewish candidates. Someone like Abe Ribicoff, the senator, was one of the first Jewish candidates to have any success in Connecticut, and that was during the Bailey era. During this period, John Bailey was also National Party chairman from 1964 to 1968, following the successes of John F. Kennedy, who he supported for president and during the presidency until his assassination in 1963. When I became a reporter in 1970, this legacy was continuing strong. John Bailey's son, John Jr., was the top prosecutor in the Hartford region, and we'd see him around and cover his cases. John Bailey's daughter, Barbara Kennelly, became a member of Congress representing Hartford, succeeding William Cotter, a cousin of John, who had been state insurance commissioner and was creating headlines with whether to approve or not the world's biggest merger in history, the merger of Hartford Fire Insurance Company of the CIA, Richard Helms, and many mob figures, as well as many other clients, both notorious and famous. It's a little hard for me to believe that the O'Loughlin family and Edward Bennett Williams, owner of the Washington Redskins, among other things, Daily Communicate and Mass, did not intersect in this world of law and power, either in Washington or back in Hartford. But this is all a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that we're still establishing the pieces. Meanwhile, let's return our narrative to the O'Loughlin's family's struggles in the 1930s in Hartford. Thomas Jr. strived mightily to succeed, growing up in a Depression-era broken home, and he received a scholarship to the very prestigious private school, Loomis, located just north of Hartford. His classmates included George Schultz, who went on to become the leader of the huge worldwide engineering firm Bechtel, as well as US Secretary of State and a constant presence in public affairs, who just died recently. Tom also won a scholarship to Harvard College, where he was a tackle on the football team. He attended Columbia University in New York City for postgraduate military training in 1942, before undertaking expert and dangerous World War II and FBI assignments that you're going to hear about later today. These latter periods of Tom Jr.'s life included extremely harrowing and impressive duties of continuing historical importance. It was part of the tragedy of the times and his own particular upbringing and culture of conduct that he became obsessed with his duties. He had great difficulty opening up to his family, including his son John, who loved and needed him, and then, as you've heard, lost him at age 18 to a mysterious sudden cancer and without a proper goodbye. A few moments ago, I started this tribute to Tom Jr. with a story of President Eisenhower and the QED. The purpose of this last story is, as I wind up, to try to pull this all together. It goes back to the presidential speechwriter I mentioned, James Humes, and he talked, as I'll share my conclusion here, he talks about Lou Little, the iconic football coach first at Georgetown and then at Columbia University. Little's career included leading his Columbia team to the Rose Bowl and grooming the great quarterback Sid Luckman, who revolutionized quarterbacking in football. President Eisenhower called Lou Little one of the greatest men I've ever known. The last part of my story here is not to rave about football, but to talk about something more universal, about our need for connection and respect, even as we struggle to overcome life's constant challenges. The story goes this way. In 1928, Lou Little coached Georgetown, and he had a reserve named Dennis Flaherty, who attended every scrimmage and every game with an older man. On the day of Georgetown's game against Holy Cross, its big rival, the scrub player came up to the coach and said, "Mr. Little, could I start in today's game?" "Son," the coach replied, "you're too small." "Oh, Mr. Little," came the response, "I don't do what you want, pull me out." Coach let him start the game. And the results were so spectacular that coach left him in the entire 60 minutes. Offense, defense, kicking. And after the game, the coach said, "Flaherty, how did you know you could play a game like that?" Here's the response. "Well, Mr. Little, that was my dad I came with every day. Dad was blind. And last night he had a heart attack. This was the first time he could see me play." In the same spirit, I'd like to think that Thomas O'Loughlin Jr., who we're here to honor, can see from afar just how much his son loves him. And in ways almost impossible to see or express during troubled times for that family 5 decades ago, Tom's son is here to say and show how he admires his son's extraordinarily brave public service, and so should we. Thank you.
By the way, we have a cake, and I suppose everyone's had a chance to have a look at it. Somebody's going to have to go over there and get the first piece. So, oh, it's me. Okay. Well, I think we'll press forward with another of our speakers. The next we have on deck, Andy. Are we lined up with Professor Hamamoto? All right. Well, everybody here knows Professor Hamamoto, and I won't take the time to give much of an introduction, except for I just love Professor Hamamoto. He has been a regular with my show on a weekly basis with George for our Thursday night trios, and a number of times I've had the privilege of interviewing him directly. The author of Servitors of Empire, a key to understanding how these elite families that Andy Craig told us about would get things done by perhaps inducing some immigrant people to do them for them. Well, with that introduction, I give you Professor Hamamoto. Andy, I think we'll be able to hear him on the speakers, but we don't have the ability to hook up the video right now.
Professor.
Hello.
There he is.
Oh,
So you can see him on your screens, I guess, and we'll go with it. We'll go, if that'll work.
For his kind invitation, allowing me to address this wonderful gathering of friends and relatives, and of course the Osprey Nation, which is not just U.S., it seems to be global now. And I wish to thank Mrs. O'Loughlin for her hospitality that she has extended to you there out in the Potomac, the beautiful Potomac, and those of us who are living across the country. Thank you, Mrs. O'Loughlin. We tip our hat to you. And, you know, I feel a special closeness to the family history of the O'Loughlins, since Mr. Thomas O'Loughlin and my own father, I believe, were born in the same year. I think it's 1920. If I'm wrong, you can correct me later, John. And I seem to recall that John and I were also born in the same year, but to spare us any embarrassment, we can confirm that at some other time, given our age, right? So in any case, our respective families were living our lives at the same critical moment in history. I know everybody thinks that their moment in history is critical, but I'll stick to that story. All right, we're living our same lives, the similar lives, let's say, at this critical moment in history. Now we were on two different coasts, but we were unified by the same, let's call it, media system. Mr. Craig was, you know, a newspaper man, and he's well acquainted with the rise of television, you know, following radio, and of course we have the so-called social media today. Even so, even though it was kind of like a national culture, you know, as we were talking a couple of weeks ago, we were bound by the Ed Sullivan Show, you know, even though it was on time delay out here on the West Coast. But we were kept innocent. I think it's safe to say, all of us, adults, that's parents, you know, our parents, to a lesser extent, because they were mature and they could read between the lines. But certainly we children, John and I, we were kept innocent of the darker aspects of our national history and our politics. And you know the sources, school and various civic organizations and the new. Prosperity, but I don't know about John, but I took it for granted. I thought that's just the way it was. And I wasn't really cognizant of the struggles and the sacrifices of the previous generations until I matured, grew up, and understood history a little bit better. But anyway, this era of prosperity lasted for quite a while in retrospect. It lasted for at least a couple decades. But by around the late 70s, the 80s for sure, this great dream, this dream of the universal middle-class society, the secure, economically productive, endlessly productive society and secure, materially secure society, that whole image began to prove to be an illusion for growing numbers of Americans in the population. Right, including the great working class people. Mr. Craig gave a really great social history and overview of the culture, the working class culture of Hartford, Connecticut. And that story was being repeated all over this great nation of ours. And this is something that I think everybody in this room and everybody that's watching wants to see return to the American Republic. So there was this. Nonetheless, there was this underside, not to be a downer, but there was an underside of American history through the 1950s and 1960s that we baby boomers, John and I, we were oblivious to it. I think it's safe to say. Our parents had lived through the Great Depression. You know, both my parents, who were born and raised in the territory of Hawaii, you know, they talked about how they just would go to school barefoot. Of course, it was in the tropics, and you know, and the weather was perfect year round. But anyway, they were, you know, not very well off. But that was a story that was being played out throughout the country, throughout the world, really, right? And this is what led to the the hostilities of World War II, right, which I'll get to in a moment. So our parents lived through this Great Depression, and it's more than just a cliche. It's real. It's a lived experience, and they brought through this. They lived it through their bodies and their cultural, their historical, their political memory. And I think that's one of the real reasons why this generation that preceded us were both the men and the women. Let's not forget the mothers and the ladies who really held down the household much to our advantage, as it turns out. So they live through this, and it's not just some sort of historical marker. It's very much with us here today in the 21st century. And then came the deprivations of World War II, including rationing and coupons for food and gas and all sorts of deprivations that are really unthinkable for today's generation. So John and I, we grew up in this sort of paradisical society. And I don't know if we appreciate it or not. At least I kind of just took it for granted. So we boomers lived what the Beach Boys referred to as the endless summer. Wow, the endless summer. I mean, what a utopia, right? On the other hand, I recall my mother just kind of telling me, not just shaking her finger at us, telling us how great we had it. And that was my dad's job. He always liked to tell us how spoiled we were. But I recall my mother telling me how she had to carry a gas mask to school in case the Japanese Imperial Navy decided to return to the Hawaiian Islands for another attack. And I just couldn't fathom that. And then later on came this whole fright operation. This was a psyop before I knew what a psyop was. They just scared us daily. We would have to duck and cover. I don't know if John had to do this at his school, but we had to hit the deck. We went under the desk and we covered our vital parts and prayed that it would be a quick ending, right? And there was all this this is when television was really big, is coming in, and we were being hit by this constantly. And we grew up with this sort of low-grade paranoia for decades afterwards. So my mother was a teenager, a little girl, early high school, I guess, when Pearl Harbor hit, and shortly thereafter, this is how history operates. Mr. Thomas O'Loughlin was sailing to the South Pacific. He had got his commission, as Mr. Craig had alluded to earlier, at he went through officer training school at Columbia University, and he was commissioned as a naval officer. So he headed out there on those great ships, many of which, by the way, were constructed not far from where I am now, here in Oakland, California. And Mare Island is part of Mr. O'Loughlin's story. I think the USS Nashville had a history there. By the way, there was a huge explosion that killed a lot of people in 1944 on the island out there. Was a huge ammunition depot, and they could hear the explosion, and windows were breaking all the way to the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is a heavy militarized part of the country as well, California. This is the gateway to the Pacific, right? And that's, by the way, why the University of California was built by these very skull and bones people, members, right? Sworn in, this blood brotherhood. They started the University of California here in order to face the Pacific and then colonize that area as part of this larger process of economic consolidation that we're seeing the end game right now here. So as we've learned, you and me, and people all over the world now, over the past year, we've been exposed to the historical research and these discoveries. It's just, you know them. I don't have to rehearse them here with you. The TDY revelations, that was a good one. So we got to live through this, and it's brought us to this point here, and it's just amazing. Really a revolutionary working method on doing history, not just family history, but this is national history. This is world history that we're talking about right here and now, through the person of one Thomas Francis O'Loughlin and family. and all the great Irish American military people who had fought for this country, dating back to the Revolution, well, especially the Civil War, because it was so bad, the carnage was so bad, even the Pope had to say, hey, listen, you know, all my recent immigrant who are Irish Catholics are really overrepresented in the death numbers there, right? So this is part of a large historical tradition that Mr. O'Loughlin is following. He's following that trajectory. And I don't know if he himself conceived it that way, but that's how I look at it from a historical perspective. So we've learned that, and again, this is part of this process of discovery that's so exciting to me. I can just imagine what it's like for John. But Mr. O'Loughlin was a commissioned officer, and he was assisting. He was there at the right hand at the highest level of military command out in the South Pacific, including, as it turns out, General Douglas MacArthur. Yes, Douglas MacArthur, General Douglas MacArthur, right? And for myself, even in the 1950s, being part of the television and the comics books generation, and in the magazine, you know, we read Life magazine. My family had a subscription. There was Life magazine here, and there's Reader's Digest. I think both of those two publications taught me how to read, and it was kind of like my little window out to the world. It was a distorted window, granted, but it was a window nonetheless. So this is where we read of and learned about the exploits of General Douglas MacArthur. And there was Mr. Thomas O'Loughlin at his side, assisting in this war effort, an incredible, you know, I don't have to tell you, monumental, logistical as well as military and political exercise way out there in the South Pacific. Now, what the articles, including Life magazine, you know, the loose publications and all the rest, and television, right? William Paley's operation, CBS, and he liked to call himself General, right? Because the whole media had been kind of recruited to the war effort, right? Justifiably so. I'm not necessarily saying it's bad, but there had to be some sort of unification and unity of national resolve as well as information and propaganda. I mean, let's face it, there has to be a message, a unifying, a bonding message that the people can embrace and carry out. So what these articles and these mass market publications and network television were concealing from the American public was that, as Brutus would say, there was a serpent's egg growing within the shell of the American Republic. And this was a monster that was being hatched of stealth, of intrigue. It was being hatched of criminality, and it was being hatched even of political assassination, right? And today, this abomination is known popularly as the deep state. So this was its genesis, right? And here again, at a world historical turning point during the turbulent 1960s, right? And I don't know what John was experimenting with back then and what he was listening to, but I saw the pictures, John. You had the long hair and everything, right? You were wearing the uniform. But seriously, this is a world.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you can find the rest of that video on McDuff Lives, and just search for McDuff Memorial, and you'll be able to find that. And speaking of finding something, you can go to screamingospreys.com, and this book launch coincided with his dad's memorial that weekend, and the team worked very hard on organizing things and getting it together and having it ready for that very special day. So thank you to everyone that participated that weekend. You guys know who you are. I'm not going to go through the whole list. We'll just call it Osprey Nation, but you can find the book McDuff Lives: The Life and Untimely Death of Thomas F. O'Loughlin Jr. on screamingospreys.com and on Amazon. And we will be that was a wonderful presentation. You saw Timothy Judd playing the violin. He hung out with the group. for the entire weekend. I forget the lovely lady's name with the beautiful voice, but I didn't understand a word she said because it's in a language I don't know. But either way, that was it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard up close and in person. So that was just an awesome weekend overall. And that's what you get to do at these charrettes. We have these big group meetups around the countries where citizen journalists that participate in the chat, they participate in the journal club, they participate in our group chat chats, they email us all the time, they call us on the phone, and whenever we go to a spot in like San Diego, Louisiana, we went to New Orleans, we've been in Florida a couple times, Washington DC, West Virginia, we've had charrettes here in Michigan. It's like we get at least like 15, 20 people coming out to these things, and we cook, we eat, and we dig into the deep state, most importantly. And that was one of the most fun charrettes I've been a part of there at Mystery Island. So we're gonna switch gears here. Let me change the branding to Mr.